that's pretty neat. Today we're looking at issue 1 of Animal Pound by Tom King and Peter Gross. Now this is a heartwarming tale of a cat and a dog that live in cages right next to each other, and even though they have great differences and they hate each other at first because of those differences, they learn to love each other for the differences that they have. And it's a tale of diversity and love. Not really. Animal Pound is a direct retelling of the classic story, Animal Farm, which you may remember from middle school or high school depending on what district you went to. And if you don't remember Animal Farm, basically, it's about the animals on a farm who overthrow the farmers and take over the farm themselves, and eventually this idea of shared equality, which looks a lot like communism, descends into fascism. And it's an allegory for the Soviet Union, which had a very similar rise and fall. And the setup in Animal Pound has a ton of similarities to the setup in Animal Farm. But whereas Animal Farm is about communism, Animal Pound looks like it's gonna be about a two-party democracy. But Tom King did do a really good job of making Animal Pound have the exact same type of language, the exact same tone as Animal Farm. It feels like George Orwell's writing as you read Animal Pound by Tom King. For example, let's take a look at the first sentence in each of them. In Animal Pound, the first sentence is, Mr. Jones of the Manfield Pound had locked the cat cages for the evening, but was too drunk to notice a small hole in the upper wall. And the first time I read that, I thought, why is this security guard drunk on the job? What an idiot! But then I read the first sentence of Animal Farm, which is, Mr. Jones of the Manor Farm had locked the hen houses for the night, but was too drunk to remember to shut the pop holes. So it's the exact same thing. In the comic, we get this old dog named Lucky, who's supposed to represent Old Major from Animal Farm, who's supposed to represent Karl Marx. And my guess is that the dog in Animal Pound is named Lucky because it's a reference to the book where the character Old Major says, For myself I do not grumble, for I am one of the lucky ones. Maybe. Now in Animal Pound, just like in Animal Farm, all the animals agree that the problem is man. They use that word specifically. And in Animal Farm, really early on, the idea of rebellion is brought up. And even though the word rebellion isn't precisely used in Animal Pound, they do talk about opening all the doors, which is what man has control over. So it's the same idea. The discussion between the dogs and cats in Animal Pound about whether the rabbits who are also in the pound are food or friends is very similar to the question that is raised in Animal Farm, are rats comrades? I think that the main cat, Fifi, and the main dog, Titan, are supposed to represent Napoleon the pig from Animal Farm, and Snowball the pig from Animal Farm, but this is where the stories start to differ. Because in Animal Farm, these two leaders who didn't get along were still part of the same party, and eventually one of the leaders was kicked out so that the other leader could lead the whole country with his single fascist government. Whereas in Animal Pound, if we have two leaders from two different parties, then we're setting the story up to be a two-party based government, because I don't think people still need refreshers about why communism is a bad idea. Another direct parallel between Animal Pound and Animal Farm is that the animals learned how to read and write in both stories. But in Animal Pound, it was a point made that everybody should learn how to read and write, whereas in Animal Farm, only the pigs figured out how to read and write, so only they had that power. So the main plot of issue 1 here is that Lucky the dog has a dream, and then he's put down because it's a pound. And then the cats and the dogs unite and have secret meetings for a while, figuring out how to do a rebellion, and then eventually they do rebel, and they have the pound all to themselves, and they've kicked out all the people. So basically, the first issue of Animal Pound is a parallel to the first 2 chapters of Animal Farm. One of the things in Animal Pound that's similar to Animal Farm, but it's not a direct parallel, is this character Raven. Now Raven is this giant cat here, and he's very cynical, and he doesn't really believe in the rebellion, and he doesn't really believe that everything is going to work out in the rebellion. Now given that the cat's name is Raven, it's probably a direct reference to Moses, the raven from Animal Farm. Now Moses the Raven is basically an allegory for the church in Animal Farm, but the characters in the story do not like him because he basically spreads lies to everybody. Eventually, the pigs realize that they need Moses to suppress the population by giving them ideas of basically religion so that they won't revolt against the pigs. But in general, he's cynical and he's just there to stir up trouble. In Animal Pound, we see that Raven does not believe in the rebellion and tries to tell people it's a bad idea, but then once the rebellion has happened, he's just left with this feeling that something is wrong, that something is gonna not work out, and it's all gonna come back to bite them. Which doesn't really seem like a misinformation spreading character. It seems like he's just the wisest one here. So I'm not sure what Tom King is doing with Raven. I don't know if it's on purpose that he's different, or if there just wasn't enough space in the story for him to be the same. I don't know. So what we've got here is a modern retelling of a classic story about the dangers of self-governance, in particular, the dangers of communism leading to fascism. But like I think I said before, I think this is setting us up for a two-party system to lead us to fascism. And the reason I think that is because Tom King said in an interview that he was inspired to write this story when he personally witnessed the January 6th riots. And here's what he had to say about that. This was not people trying to create a communist utopia and it descending into fascism. This is people people trying to take advantage of a system that is working, but take advantage of the flaws in that system to overthrow democracy. So this is a really ambitious project. I'm really excited to see where he goes with it, because I don't think it's going to keep being directly parallel to the book. I think he's going to have his own ending for a modern audience. However, this isn't just a modern retelling of a beloved classic book, it is also a comic book. And if you remove the literary parallels between Animal Pound and Animal Farm, like if you don't know anything about Animal Farm, you can't remember it from when you were in high school or whatever, and if you view Animal Pound as just a comic book, and that's all it is, then this is not that amazing of a comic book. Because the basic plot is that cats and dogs are in cages, and they don't want to be in cages, so they get out of their cages and kick out all the people who work at the pound. That's a pretty common, predictable story. And in this first issue, that's all that happened. They got out of their cages, and now they have the building to themselves. That's it. And the artwork from Peter Gross is pretty good. You might recognize Peter Gross from his work on American Jesus with Mark Millar. It's not the most eye-catching art. It does its job, but that's about it. And don't get me wrong, there's a million ways to draw animals incorrectly, and he's drawing the animals really well. But as far as comic book art goes, it's just a little bit unremarkable, especially when you compare it to the animal comic that I rate all other animal comics against, We 3. We 3 is a far more compelling story about animals in general with much more interesting art. So I know that this is kind of a basic favorite animal comic to have, but it's really good, and you can't really help but rate other animal-based comics by that one. So if you're a fan of literature, and if you're a fan of Animal Farm, this is super cool. If you don't know anything about literature or Animal Farm, and you just like comic books, this is okay. There are some other deviations from the main storyline of Animal Farm in Animal Pound, and I'm not sure how much of that is just being concise with the number of pages he had to work with, or differences in narrative that he's going to follow up on later to make his story different than Animal Farm. I just don't know. There's a lot of questions I have, and they'll probably be answered by the end of the series, so maybe I'll do another video when the series is over, all 4 issues have come out. But for now, issue 1 of Animal Pound is pretty good from a literary standpoint. I know that people have been saying it's a bit too wordy, and it is wordy. There are a lot of words in here, especially considering how much action goes with each word bubble. But the point isn't to tell a story about animals escaping their cages, the point is to retell Animal Farm. So it's gonna be wordy. You just gotta be ready for that. So I feel a little bit bad for Tom King because he's on quite the balance beam with this issue. He's balancing a ton of stuff, and he said in interviews that he's very intimidated by the magnitude of this project. But to be fair to the other comics that I review, this comic is like a high 6, low 7 out of 10. And I'm saying that because the average reader probably doesn't see all the little parallels between this and Animal Farm. I mean, I have a literature degree, and I still could not have pointed out all the parallels between this and Animal Farm a week ago off the top of my head if you had asked me to. I had to read the book again just to realize how similar they were. So to the average reader, it's just an overly wordy story about cats and dogs getting out of cages so far, which is why I'm giving it a high 6, low 7 out of 10. Did you read it? What do you think? Today's question comes from John Hummel, and he wants to know, what is the best comic book? Bone. Bone by Jeff Smith is the best comic book of all time. That is all.